I'm Amy Schlusser. I'm the staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. I'm also the lead author of our Deconstructing Diesel report, which presents a roadmap for reducing diesel emissions in the Portland metropolitan area. In adherence to the optimistic theme of the evening, I'm going to be discussing a really uplifting issue, the environmental justice impacts of Portland's diesel pollution problem. I'm also going to be describing some potential strategies for addressing this issue. So before I start, I want to first explain what we mean when we talk about environmental justice. The Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force defines environmental justice as equal protection from environmental and health hazards and meaningful public participation in decisions that affect the environment in which people live, learn, practice spirituality, and play. Environmental justice communities include minority and low-income communities, tribal communities, and other communities traditionally underrepresented in public processes. Environmental justice issues arise when traditionally underrepresented communities are disproportionately burdened by pollution and other negative environmental impacts resulting from inequitable decision-making. So just to quickly go over some of the really bad things about diesel pollution. Diesel pollution is a serious threat to human health. Exposure to diesel pollution causes cancer, increases risk of heart attack and stroke, and exacerbates asthma and other respiratory disorders. Diesel pollution has been linked to declines in cognitive function, particularly among children and the elderly, and there's an emerging body of evidence linking diesel pollution to neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism and Alzheimer's disease. Diesel pollution-related illnesses contribute to absences from school and work. It's estimated that exposure to diesel exhaust causes 25,000 lost workdays in Oregon each year. Diesel pollution also has really negative impacts on the environment. In addition to contributing to smog and acid rain, diesel pollution, most of the particulate matter emitted from diesel engines is black carbon. And as that amazing video that we watched earlier showed, black carbon is an extremely potent climate forcer. So the entire Portland metro area has unhealthy levels of diesel pollution. This map is from the Portland Air Toxic Solutions study that was published in 2011, and it shows estimated diesel particulate levels throughout the Portland metro area. As you can see from the map, pretty much all of Portland has diesel particulate levels that are at least 5 times higher than the state's health-based ambient benchmark concentrations. And many parts of the city have levels that are more than 10 times higher than the state's benchmark concentrations. It's hard to tell from this map, but diesel pollution levels tend to be higher around major roadways and highways and around locations where large numbers of diesel engines operate, such as construction sites, rail yards, and distribution warehouses. So while no part of Portland has safe levels of diesel pollution, communities of color and low-income communities generally have higher levels of diesel pollution than other parts of the city. When you compare demographic maps for race, such as the map on the top left, and income, the map on the bottom left, to the PATS map from the previous slide, it's clear that neighborhoods with predominantly low income or minority populations have much higher levels of diesel pollution than neighborhoods that are predominantly white or higher income. This isn't surprising because in Portland and in Oregon as a whole, there's a strong correlation between race and income. And as the map on the right shows, the lighter color equates to lower property values. So property values tend to be lower near major roadways and near facilities that generate a lot of emissions, like industrial facilities and rail yards and ports. This means that low-income communities and communities of color are located near major sources of diesel pollution, which is an environmental justice issue. Diesel pollution presents a particularly concerning environmental justice issue in the context of schools for younger generations. Studies have found that when students move to schools that have higher levels of traffic pollution, their academic performance declines and rates of behavioral issues and absences increase. A study conducted on public school children in California found that even a small decrease in outdoor diesel particulate concentrations had a positive impact on academic performance. Unfortunately, some of Portland's most underperforming schools are located in neighborhoods that have extremely high levels of diesel pollution. I'm going to now focus on 3 of these schools to help illustrate the connection between environmental justice and diesel pollution in this area. So first, we're going to look at Madison High School. It's in Northeast Portland. Out of approximately 1,100 students, 65% are people of color and 63% come from low-income families. Madison's standardized test scores for math, science, and English are all below the state's average, which means that a majority of students at these schools are not performing at their grade level. Madison High School also has estimated diesel particulate concentrations of up to 1.83 micrograms per cubic meter. This number might not mean anything to a lot of you, but it means that children that attend this high school are exposed to diesel pollution levels that are 14 to 18 times higher than the state's benchmark concentrations. Most of this pollution probably comes from on-road vehicles because Madison High School is located really close to the interchange between I-84 and 205. According to ODOT estimates, 14,000 to 28,000 trucks travel within a mile of Madison High School every day. I also want to note that Madison High School is currently undergoing renovations, so there aren't any students attending the school right now. Next, let's look at Jefferson High School, which is also in Northeast Portland. Out of 656 students, 69% are people of color and 68% are from low-income families. Jefferson's standardized test scores are far below the state average. Only 6% of students tested proficient for math during the last testing period. Also, like Madison High School, Jefferson has estimated diesel particulate levels that are up to 1.83 micrograms per cubic meter. Jefferson is really close to I-5, and 10,000 to 19,000 trucks travel within a quarter mile of the school every day. But that isn't the only issue. Additionally, the neighborhood around Jefferson High School is in the midst of a construction boom. So this map is a screenshot from a program being developed by Neighbors for Clean Air. It's called the Construction Site Finder. This is taken from its beta mode. It's scheduled for public release in 2020. The red circles and diamonds represent commercial construction projects, and the size of this shape corresponds to the square footage of the project. So the larger the shape, the generally more emissions will be associated with the project. And Jefferson High School students aren't the only kids that are breathing in these construction emissions. There are more than 24 other schools and daycares that are located within the same area. Finally, I want to look at Roosevelt High School. It's located in the St. John's neighborhood in North Portland. Out of just under 1,000 students, 70% are people of color, Like Jefferson High School, Roosevelt's test scores are far below the state average. Also, Roosevelt High School has a notably high absentee rate. In the 2016 to 2017 school year, 40% of the student body was absent for at least 10% of school days. Like Madison and Jefferson High School, Roosevelt High School is located in a neighborhood that has extremely elevated levels of diesel pollution, which isn't surprising because the school and the entire St. John's community is surrounded by large sources of diesel emissions, including multiple marine and rail terminals and several heavy industrial sites. The school also has train tracks running almost right next to it. These types of sources are known as indirect sources of air pollution because they produce large quantities of emissions from mobile sources like trucks and construction equipment that are either operating within the facility or are associated with the facility in some way. Now, I don't mean to imply that diesel pollution is the sole reason for the low test scores at these public schools. Diesel pollution is just one of many factors that are holding back kids at these schools. But if we can solve this problem, then we can help minimize one of those factors. So what can we do to solve it? We can mitigate many of the environmental justice impacts of diesel pollution by reducing emissions from on-road vehicles. These are diesel trucks and buses. One way to reduce emissions from on-road vehicles is by adopting in-use performance standards for existing vehicles. The good news is that we've already made some progress in this area. In 2019, the legislature adopted HB 2007, which established in-use performance standards for many diesel truck fleets that are registered in the Portland metro area. In-use performance standards, essentially, they just prohibit the titling and registration of older, more polluting vehicles beyond a certain date. So the standards that were included in HB 2007 won't fully go into effect until 2029. They also only apply to vehicles that are registered in the Portland metro area. So we can further reduce emissions from diesel vehicles that are traveling through the Portland area by adopting mandatory truck routes that divert truck traffic away from neighborhoods with elevated levels of diesel pollution, and by establishing dynamic road user fees, or tolls, that increase during periods of traffic congestion, and by establishing toll rates that are higher for multi-axle vehicles, we can help deter diesel trucks from traveling through the city when on-road emissions are peaking. We can also enforce the state's idling restrictions, particularly near schools and other vulnerable locations. We also need to reduce emissions from construction equipment. The City of Portland and Multnomah County have made some progress in this area by adopting clean air construction standards for local public improvement contracts, and HB 2007 included similar requirements for state public improvement contracts. Together, these policies will eventually ensure that the equipment that's used on large public projects meets the most stringent federal emission standards. But those construction standards only apply to public contracts. So to reduce emissions from commercial construction projects, local governments can impose restrictions on development permits. These restrictions, for example, could require that contractors use equipment that has modern pollution controls, or prohibit them from using highly emitting equipment during certain times of the day, like when kids are playing outside during recess. Local permitting agencies should also consider aggregate pollution impacts from all active construction projects before issuing development permits. And third, we can mitigate some of the environmental justice impacts from diesel pollution by engaging in equity-focused decision-making. We can do so by incorporating environmental justice and equity considerations into state and local diesel-related policies, and by educating and partnering with environmental justice communities to identify targeted actions for addressing diesel pollution issues in local communities. And finally, we can adopt indirect source rules that restrict aggregate emissions from all mobile sources operating within or associated with specific types of facilities. Indirect source rules are particularly promising for reducing emissions in environmental justice communities because you can reduce the total amount of mobile source emissions that are produced within a relatively localized area. So this is a satellite image of the St. John's neighborhood. The circles represent large indirect sources. And as you can see, there are quite a few large indirect sources within a relatively constrained geographic area. And together, the mobile sources operating at these facilities produce large quantities of emissions that present a serious health risk to local communities, particularly the residents that live in the neighborhood that's kind of adjacent to the industrialized zone. So before I turn this stage over to Linda George, I want to note that diesel pollution is a challenging problem because it isn't created by just a handful of large industrial sources. Rather, it's the result of tens of thousands of individual mobile sources operating within or traveling through our city on a daily basis. But the fact that it's a challenging problem to solve is not an excuse to do nothing. Particularly when our inaction creates a direct threat for environmental justice communities. If we can solve Portland's diesel problem, we can eliminate at least one of the major factors that are holding back particularly younger generations in underrepresented communities. And at the same time, we can help make the entire metropolitan region a healthier, safer place to be. So, thank you.